You want to go live?
Oh, good, we went live.
All right, so our next panel is, we have Tal Tsfany and Gena Gorlin. I haven't told you anything about them yet, so how do you know you want to applaud? But yeah. So Tal is the president and CEO of the Ayn Rand Institute. He also runs the happiness team, which you can find out more about in myhappiness.team. And Gena is a psychologist. She has spoken before right here at an Ayn Rand Center UK event, our best attended event to date. And she does have a Substack, genagorlin.substack.com. Yeah, I think, actually, should I ask people, just so we're clear, how many people here in the audience, we can't ask this of the YouTube audience, how many of you have read anything by Ayn Rand at any point in your life? All right, that is most people. So, all right, that is, the context has been set, so please join me in welcoming Gena and Tal. Thank you.
I'll kick it off?
Go for it.
So actually, we're talking about the title. The title is The Psychology of SelfCreation. So I want to just stress that self-creation is going to be the main topic. And I want to start by asking the one who came up with a title, what do you mean when you say self-creation?
That serves me right, since I gunned for that title. So Rand, sounds like most of us are at least familiar with some of her work, had this really important conception of human beings as self-made, right? Self-made souls. And as a psychologist, a lot of the work I've been doing is figuring out, well, how do we go about making ourselves? What does that actually mean? What is it that we're making? What about ourselves is accumulated over time, and how do our choices play into the material that we are shaping, right, within our own character? So it's the process of developing and maintaining and growing our own psychologies.
So we have the image of the self-created man, you know, the sculpture where you see the person carving their own body or soul.
There's also a woman version.
Great.
Carlyle, I think. Bobby Carlyle.
And
yeah.
so tell me a little bit about how, from a psychologist's perspective, that happens. Can you give me an example or an event, a choice that one makes that then, in a way, carves a little bit of the shape of their consciousness or who they are?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, every choice that we make, and as we get older, there's more hardened cement, and so to the extent that we want to make significant shifts to our character, to our habits, to our sense of life, as Rand described it, right, to the ways that we are, the kind of obstacles that get in our way when we're trying to do something ambitious or hard. It gets harder and requires that much more intentionality, but the kinds of things that, I guess I could sort of partition it developmentally. As a kid, kids are self-creating without any self-consciousness that they're doing so, just through the work that they do, through the particular toys or movies or books or materials that they're drawn to and that they spend time focusing on and babbling about and asking to, buy paraphernalia related to those things and sort of deepening their engagement and their interest and reacting to the ways that other kids treat them and reacting to the ways grown-ups treat them in ways that then start to form certain impressions and start to generalize to other situations that they're in, right? And all of that happens largely without kind of conscious oversight, which is where parents and teachers, right, and the culture play a really important role. And then as we grow up, we have increasingly, right, the ability to watch ourselves in the process of feeling things, thinking things, reacting to things, and to start understanding some of the causal links, that I get really defensive every time somebody questions me about my career choice, or every time somebody asks me if I'm dating, and what is that about me? What might be the underlying premise? What might be some of the ways that I'm reinforcing that premise in my day-to-day choices, et cetera.
So that moment, let's say I'm triggered about, with some kind of an anxiety, you can actually reverse it back to some kind of a decision, or which you can call a self-created aspect of you, into a value judgment that actually is the basics of that.
It's a chance to show off our matching phones.
We can switch if you
Somehow
want.
we've self-created ourselves similarly in this regard.
So,
Anyway.
can you reverse back when you say you're responsible for everything, basically, at the end of the day? So let's say I carry some kind of an anxiety or fear of something, and I trace it back. How would you think about it in the context of you actually created that anxiety or you're responsible for it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that when you mentioned you can trace it back to the moment or to the choice. I don't think that's usually true. I think it's more often not true. And I think in psychology, there's a tendency, at least within certain schools of psychology more than others, to really emphasize like important formative moments or, especially often traumatic moments. And those can be very important, don't get me wrong. But usually it's the accumulation of a lot of choices and a lot of inputs and a lot of ways we've processed those inputs over time, and ways that we've interacted with our environment and with the people around us, and that they've then interacted with us in ways that then further reinforce certain beliefs or certain fears or ways of seeing the world. So often I find it's somewhat counterproductive to try to pin down like what was the exact choice. Although, an interesting exception, I was reading one of my journals from, we're not going to get onto the subject of Ukraine, but just incidentally when I happened to be visiting. And I sort of reflected in the journal. I just read Rand just months earlier. So, I was in my big kind of like, this is the beginning of the new chapter of my life kind of mode. And I was trying to trace back kind of when I developed a certain second-handed tendency that now I realize, I'm going to have to work so hard on. I was 15. I'm going to work so hard on stomping this out, and this is such a deep part of my character, and I always care too much what everybody thinks and what, if the kids like me. And like, where did that start? And I actually traced it back, probably factitiously, but it felt right, and I think it gave me something to kind of sink my teeth into, which is like this moment in the raspberry bushes when I stopped caring about my elaborate imaginary castle underground because my friend took no interest in it.
I think in a way that's my experience as well. There are like inception points, right, where it's like I can trace it back. Big changes or decisions and so on. But you're right in the sense that after that, there's a lot of work or a lot of integrations that need to happen for you to, in a way, integrate new truths about yourself or self-perceptions.
I mean, that's interesting because actually I can think of more formative, pivotal moments like that have sent me in a more positive direction. It sounds like you might have those too.
Yeah. I remember points where I consciously made a decision to change something. Nothing changed the day after, but a year later, something changed. So
and you can trace it back, yeah. That's real.
The metaphor I use is usually it's like training a muscle. You're deciding something's going to happen and you start working on it. And over time, it changes. So does it change your attitude as a psychologist where you say, basically, it's your work, all of this, what you are is yours. It's not, your environment, your DNA, and your temperament, and all of that. So what does it put you as a psychologist where your attitude, it's basically self-creation?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. This is why I've kind of switched to this builder framework. I've been calling it self-creation. I think that's still a great term, but I've found something really valuable in thinking about it in terms of like, I'm building the builders. We build ourselves into builders because there's more of a kind of outward focus on like the things you're building, and it's through those things that you build yourself. I think there's a really important synthesis that has to happen. If I just kind of push on somebody this narrative that, look, this is your fault. You did this to yourself. It was your choices. I think that just as soon is going to kind of activate the wrong context, because for most people that's going to have the ring of a kind of like, duty-like kind of, Christian, Jewish, you name it, guilt-based kind of, premise of, well, you're out of bounds because you've sinned in effect. And I found that that's the opposite of the constructive kind of mindset that then helps people to take ownership and take a responsibility. So I think framing it in terms of building, I think really puts the emphasis kind of where it goes, which is that it's about us. It's about the things we want to experience and to create, and it's about the kind of joy we want to reap from the remaining days of our life. And then it's only to ourselves that we owe any sort of self-correction, any sort of, kind of course adjustment. And so I think that's a really important element to kind of get in there. And psychologists that I talk to are much more receptive when I kind of frame it in that way. Yeah.
So you touched on the idea of entrepreneurs, and I know you're working with some. What attracted you to work with builders, as you call them?
Yeah. So I think I've actually been thinking about this a lot. I think it's that, and I'm not an entrepreneur myself, certainly not at present. I don't know that I'll ever decide that that's the right path for me, but I don't think it's for everyone. But I've been very drawn to kind of the people in my life, we don't have to look far, who are entrepreneurs, and the kind of mindset. And in a way, I've kind of coveted and aspired to some of the qualities that I've seen are really kind of distinctive to the people who actually go and start something new and actually bring it to market and actually go through the iterations of trying to raise funds and trying to sell people on a vision that is just radical and new and different, and failing a bunch and starting over from scratch. There's, in a certain way, it's sort of like they're the exemplars of the self-creation that all of us need to do in some form. It's sort of like there's something about being entrepreneurial with respect to our lives, to the project of our lives, that I think is for everyone. And there's something we can learn from. It's like stripped down to its kind of bare naked essentials, the work that an entrepreneur has to do, because it's sort of like there's no conventional kind of scaffold, there's no rule book that they can be, borrowing from. It's
creation from scratch in a way. You don't build on anything, and it's terrifying.
Exactly.
So my experience, and we talked a little bit about that. I mean, what's unique about entrepreneurs, and I've worked with many, and I've worked in several incubators and met a lot of young people that just decided, I'm not going to work for anyone. I want to start my own thing. Sometimes they're way too young and unexperienced, so I tell them, go work somewhere and get a skill before you decide to build something on your own. But the passion, I agree with you. There's something very unique in the personality that says, it's all about me. I don't know what I'm going to build. I don't know what it's going to be. I don't know if it's going to be successful. It's just all about me. I want to manifest myself. I want to express myself. I want to take the risk. I want to pay the price. I want to work as hard as possible, as needed. I want to learn really fast. I'm not afraid of failing. Bring it on. And working in that environment is so empowering because everything is possible. You feel like, you get 3-4 people of that, that kind of personality in a room, and everything is possible because, who can take us down? So what did you find is unique when you're working with, specifically, can you put the finger about what's different about that kind of attitude, and maybe what can we learn from that?
Yeah. So I think, we talked a little bit about this notion of first principles thinking that I just kept running into, and my friends and family who are in the founder world kept using it, and Peter Thiel uses it, and Jeff Bezos uses it, and all these people that I admire kept talking about how they think in first principles, and I kept thinking, what actually does that mean? Sounds good. It sounds like something vaguely, rational and independent and whatnot, but there's something they're onto that's distinctive. It's not the way that we always necessarily think when we're being rational or independent. And I did a lot of digging to figure out what is in common to these examples that these founders give of when they thought in first principles. And I realized it's actually the depth. It's the fundamentality. Definitely there's a kind of independence of vision and judgment that, Musk wanted to fund a spaceship that would privately, send humans to Mars, right? And he started looking into the prices of rockets, and they were in the tens of millions of dollars range. And most people just would have stopped there and said, see, it's impossible. There's no way that a private enterprise could fund space travel. which is what everyone else before him had decided. Instead, he thought, what's a rocket made of? Like, how much can it cost, really? And let's deconstruct this into its sort of fundamental elements. Let's actually, it's these raw materials, and those go for this much on the commodities market. And I know from my experience with other large, manufactured objects that the manpower can't cost this much, that when he added up the price of all the commodity, the materials, it was like 2% of the total price. So he thought, this can't be right. And he kind of went back to fundamentals and decided, look, I'm just going to build my own. And then SpaceX was born. And lots of stories like that. Bezos, who talks about Amazon, like the reason he chose sort of customer obsession and these particular principles, he thought, like, what is going to remain true over time? What is still going to be true 10 years from now, 20 years from now? There's lots of things we can't count on. The market will shift. The internet will be completely different. Books, people, maybe they won't read books anymore. But they'll always want it to be cheaper. Speed. Yeah, they'll always want it to be cheaper, faster, exactly.
More variety.
And varied. Like human nature, that I can count on. So those are going to be the things that we just drill down on and always come back to. So there's a kind of cutting to the essentials, cutting down to kind of the core, like what are the deepest truths I can identify within this domain, within this endeavor, that will be relevant to all the different decisions we have to make, and that will be relevant for a long time going forward, that I can really count on as these kind of deep causal explainers, right, of a whole bunch. And, Peter Thiel also identifies it as it's a truth that's important, that's right, and that people don't agree with you on, right? So the non-consensus truth that you identified.
I would just say Ayn Rand called it check your premises in a way, And I think an audience like this that is drawn to fundamental intellectual would understand the fact that, in everything there's a premise. I assert some kind of an assertion. It's like, what premise is it based on? We've done it many, many times. Because if you want to get better at doing something, you have to find the wrong premises in other people, the way people approach solving the same problem in order to get an advantage.
Yeah.
But I want to press more about, so in a way we're all entrepreneurs. We build our souls. Yeah. And we're all a startup, right? we started up when we were born, and we're running this company, if you will, right? So what can we take from people that are highly entrepreneurial and have the courage and they can bear the risks of building something big? What does it say about the way we build our souls? What can we learn from that?
Well, I feel like you're a great person to ask about that because you've done
reverse,
it. Yeah, I mean, I really want the opportunity to hear you tell that amazing story, which is such a nice example of like those early choices. And sometimes you kind of luck into them in a certain sense, but it's what you do with them. It's how you understand them.
It actually combines what we talked about is how you. So when we were talking about preparing, and Gena talked about taking risks and entrepreneurs, and suddenly a story from when I was like 5. When do you learn how to ride a bike? About 4 or 5, right? So I just learned how to ride a bike, and the support wheels came off, and I knew how to ride my little bike. And then I remember I was in the neighborhood, and somebody was chasing me, trying to beat me or something like that. And so I was running, and I saw this big pair of bikes, like an adult bike, standing on the side, leaning on. And I realized that my only way of just getting away is getting on that bike but I never rode a big bike, and it was so big. So I got on that bike, and I remember the handles being here. And I doing like that. And in 2 seconds, I can do this. I can do this. I remember the pedals were so big and the handles, but I was actually driving that bike, and I was getting away, and I got away. And I remember when I went back to put the bikes where they were, the idea that kept coming back is like, I can do this. It was something that I thought is impossible. Yeah. There was a necessity. I took the chance. I was not afraid. I knew I could crash and fall on my face, but I did it. And the pride, the idea that It kept, I think I kept that for, I can try new things that I think is impossible, and most probably I'll handle this. And I remember when I had to make a choice if to really move from a big company to start a startup with my brother-in-law, there was a lot of anxiety in it. I'm leaving hundreds of thousands of dollars aside, and what's going to happen? I'm going to start traveling. Who knows where this company will go? There was like 1,000 reasons not to do it. But this idea of like, when I dare to go, and I've proven to myself it always surprises me. Not only it surprises me, the emotions that come with that, of like, I did this impossible things. And I love the way, when we were talking about what company to open, my partner who convinced me to join him said, look, it's going to be the first ever mobile customer relationship management system ever built. It's not going to be a better version. It's going to be the first ever. We're going to beat everyone. We're going to be, everybody wanted to be the Amazon of, we're going to be the Amazon of CRMs. And CRMs, I don't know if you know, but it has the largest, that and ERP are the largest segments of software there is.
So cool.
And we're going to reinvent, and we're going to beat all of those huge Oracles and Salesforce.com. And I was like, wow.
It's very 0 to 1.
Yeah, it was like those big bikes that I could take and start riding
that's
on.
Really
so
cool.
So yeah, there's...
That's such a great story. And that's, I mean, this is like, what happens in each of our minds when we hear that story? Because for me, things like that have happened to me. Mm-hmm. Usually they're not the things that immediately jump to mind for me when I think about the challenges that I've endured, or when I face something scary. I've had to do a lot of work on myself as an adult to like kind of pull some of those memories out of the archives and create some new ones against a lot of internal resistance, because what I remember are the times when I fell off the bike and made a big fool of myself, and the times where it didn't work out. And again, a lot of that, it's not necessarily because I didn't have experiences like that. It's sort of like, what was I noticing? What was I paying attention to from so early that, it's not a question of blame, but it is a question of, I was processing and I was making meaning of those things. And just knowing that story, being able to then sort of cross-reference it with our own experience, like we can all probably think of experiences where we just didn't think we could do it and we would never have tried, but like the fear, the necessity, the urgency kind of pushed us to go ahead and try it. And it was the right level of urgency where like, it gave us that boost of just kind of like focus and just pouring all of our energy. It was like, okay, I'm just going to take my best shot. And it worked. And sometimes it doesn't. But it's for those times that it does, and for the chance of that, right, that we take those risks.
And I have to say, people think it's like, oh, I'm entrepreneurial or not. I've seen, so we were hiring a lot of young people out of college to be in our company. And what I've seen is that when you're surrounding yourself with people that dare, and you say, okay, you're a 22-year-old, but you're so talented, why don't you manage a sales team? It's like, what? I've never managed anything in my life. No, I think you can do it. Go do it. And then 2 weeks later, they're just killing all their quotas, and he's making up. I'm thinking about a specific person that I worked with. Today, he's an entrepreneur. And I think out of our company, we got like 5 or 6 companies coming out.
Wow.
Because it's a learned skill. It's, in a way, like dare to dare. That's what I would say is the gist of all of it. People spend their whole lives trying to protect themselves, As Ayn Rand said, it's not death that we fear, it's life, or how she said that, we wish to avoid, it's life that we wish to live. Yeah. And I think that says a lot about the entrepreneurial spirit, which is like, no, I'm not afraid.
Or it's not about the fear.
It's not about the fear.
Right? Sure, you're afraid. Like you said, of course you were afraid. But fear, in some ways, is the most dominant emotion.
Good chance I will suffer through. And there were like low points.
But the fear is not the point, right? In fact, if anything, the fear, in the context of daring for something really great and really worth doing, the fear just becomes part of the reality of, like, this means something to me, right? The fear is a signal that you're doing something right in those contexts.
It's part of the fun, in the sense that, our story, every startup has this, like, nearly near-death experience story, and ours was, we were running out of money. We were like, we couldn't pay I think we had like a month and a half of payroll left, and we were dying to raise money, and then we thought somebody's going to invest, so we were like a little too sure of ourselves, and then that went away.
As these things do.
And then another one fell through, and we found ourselves just chasing money. And I remember that night in a horrible hotel when we were like pitching to someone, and they said no, and we went back to the hotel. I was like, that's it, we're dead.
We're dead.
Right? And we had that last meeting at 9 a.m., and we're like, we have to change our strategy. Everybody's saying no. And so we stayed up all night creating a new presentation, and he was our last chance, and of course he gave us the money.
It's so funny. There's so many stories like that.
Yeah.
And I think one of the key learnings when you asked, what can we all learn from the entrepreneurial kind of spirit? And I think a key learning is that we need to put ourselves in situations like that, because that's when we grow. That's when we level up. And we don't want to put ourselves in those situations. It feels
but
like,
what about,
the farthest from what we want.
What about this natural tendency of our subconscious to protect us, to say, don't go for it, don't do it, we don't want change, we don't want risk. What do you do with that?
We don't want hurt, we don't want failure, we don't want shame.
How do you control that?
So Ben Horowitz, who's another founder I really admire.
The hard thing about hard.
First of all, read that book. That's one of my big recommendations. But also, he has this blog post about what do you run toward or away from the fear? And I've linked to it in so many different things that I've written and done with founders, because I think it's so key. He talks about exactly kind of the moments where you have this niggling feeling that I have not actually, like there's some sort of a hole in our marketing strategy, but it could very easily brush it under the rug and just sort of ignore it and pay attention to the success signals over here. And it really, it makes me really uncomfortable to think that we might not have thought this through, because now we're all, that means we will have wasted 7 months on developing the wrong strategy, and we'll have to start over, and the sunk cost. What do you then do with that feeling, right? Because that the natural inclination, the kind of like animal part of us that's just very kind of short-term reactive, right, is going to want to run for the hills. Right. And you've got to be able to access that other part, which is quieter, which is deeper, which is more conceptual, which is more visionary, the part that sees the fear as a really, really valuable signal from reality that we want to pay attention to, right? That, I want to know. And to be able to sort of like channel the underlying kind of worship of our own potential, right? The worship of like, this is what it means to be human, is to be able to form and expand our judgment of reality in this ongoing way, and to be so willing to love living, to love reality, to love the truth so much that we go toward it even when it hurts, and even when it's so hard, and when it's so hard to see our way kind of past it and through it, but those are the moments that make me human. Those are the moments that make me me.
And those are the moments that make your journey a heroic journey, right?
Exactly.
It's the low points. And again, a lot of when I talk to people about how hard it's going to be if they make a decision, I see the risks as this is part of the journey. You want those low points. We try to avoid mainly lack of clarity. I think people are afraid of not knowing where. I need to know where I'm going, and sometimes when you're going into like really hard challenges, I'll just give an example. This whole idea of creating a university, Ayn Rand University. It's like, what is that going to happen? What is going to end like? And all the questions from everybody. What is the vision? It's like, guys, I don't know. It's a great idea. Everybody agrees it's a great idea. It's a path that we're going to take, and we don't know where it's going to end. It's going to evolve over time, and I embrace the lack of clarity and how are we going to be competitive in the market? And there's so many questions, and the ability to embrace that in a way fear and
the work
that needs to go into it, and the hardships that will come.
Yeah.
So I find that a lot of people have trained themselves to evade and just brush away everything that feels uncomfortable. when you are going to explain to me what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, and how we're going to succeed, maybe then I'll come and join your project.
Right.
And that's boring.
Not very entrepreneurial.
For me, that's boring.
It
If
just
you know,
limits your scope, right?
if you know the outcome, if you know it's going to be a smooth sail all the way through, why bother? Right?
Yeah.
Go eat the ice
Yeah.
cream and have fun and go to sleep.
Not very
I think
entrepreneurial.
one of the things that I've learned, and people talk about Israel as a startup nation. One of the things that I think is really good about the Israeli culture is that it's tough. People are tough on you, and they expect, like I always said, if you're working I remember I was like 25, and I was working for like the third year in the same company, and I was meeting a friend. He said, "You're working for the same company for 3 years? You're a loser." And I was like,
Wow.
vice president already. And I was like, I came out, it's like, what was he saying? And I reflected on that there's something about the Israeli culture that expects you to take risks. And when I moved to the US, all of my neighbors, like I have 25 years in AT&T and 500 years in, this company. And that was supposed to be the standard, right? So I found that as maybe we just, I don't know why it is, but maybe it's because of the Jews being persecuted over and over again. But
Yeah, but I'd be really curious about that actually. And
but,
Tal,
yeah.
maybe you can speak to this more, because I get this, if we're going to kind of do some cultural analysis on, what is it about Israel and kind of what are the core premises, if you will, right? The kind of the metaphysics, the sense of life that's dominant and that's sort of in the air, and
Right.
what is it here and what is, and I get the sense, and I mean, you'll know much better having actually, grown up there, but I get the sense there's also a real darkness and a real malevolence
in Israel,
to that,
in general?
to the Israeli spirit.
There is, but I don't think it's associated to what we were talking about. I think it's not, in a way, it's not related. There's a lot of pressure.
Well, but the pressure is related.
I think the
think.
pressure is related.
And I wonder to what extent reaping the full emotional rewards of the entrepreneurship might be tougher.
I think the altruism, it just corrupts everything. I have friends who have more money than they can ever spend,
And they're probably not
miserable.
happy at all.
They're miserable, and
yeah.
the minute they sell their company and make $100 million, they switch around and create another one,
Yep.
almost as an escape.
Yep. Yeah,
I
because
remember-
that's
yeah.
another kind of motivation by fear, right? It's the kind of
Completely.
motivation by the fear of not living up to that kind of duty-based,
I'm not worth
altruistic
anything
standard.
if I'm not creating.
Right. And that's a dangerous mindset in its own right. So this is where I've found a lot of insight in kind of thinking about this builder's mindset as being the third way. I mean, this is obviously straight from Rand, as you'll probably notice, but this is a way I've found helpful to kind of hold it, that there are these mindsets that I see everyone, myself included, every ambitious person certainly that I've known, toggles back and forth between what I've come to call kind of the Zen master mindset, which is kind of the take it easy, don't get too attached to outcomes, don't be too ambitious, don't worry too much about, God forbid that you kind of get excited about something and then it doesn't work out and then you fail. So kind of the, kind of coasting mentality on the one hand, and the drill sergeant, as I've been referring to it on the other hand. And I have a real, when I think of the Israeli spirit, I think of the drill sergeant. And the builder to me is really just a radical third alternative where both the drill sergeant and the Zen master, they're imposing, they're detaching you from reality in a certain way, right? The Zen master detaches you from reality by just kind of focusing entirely on your subjectivity and to hell with reality. We can't control it anyway, right? The drill sergeant detaches you, because who cares about you? Give me the outcomes, right? It's not for yours. It's not about you. Quit your, whining and your, who cares about your happiness,
And it needs
right?
to be hard, and
it needs to hurt, right? And it needs to pass some sort of muster with some sort of external arbiter that is not you.
Right.
And both are dangerous, right? And both are wrong, and both are really seductive in different ways. And people will, and I know this both firsthand because I've had to really kind of catch myself, and everyone I've worked with in some form has sort of, I could kind of boil down their struggle to the way in which they're caught between these two false, kind of halves of this dichotomy. And it's really subtle, but really powerful to realize, wait, no, there's actually a different way of talking to myself, where I care about outcomes, where I am holding myself accountable, but for me,
Exactly.
and not for any other. I don't owe this to anyone, except insofar as, like, I want to be able to drink my life to the lees. I want to milk the most joy, the most excitement, the most value.
And that's where
that
I see the
can.
gap, because as I said, there are people that are really successful and they don't reap the rewards.
Right.
It's like, no, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. It's almost like, it's like a duty that,
Right.
and they don't know how to enjoy it, and they don't know how to,
And it's kind of tragic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You talked about another thing when we were talking about entrepreneurs, which is bias for action and independence.
Yeah.
Let's talk about those two things that you've seen. So how do you think, I want to start with bias for action, because that's a big thing for me.
Yeah.
How do you think about bias for action, or action bias?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's definitely one of the traits, one of the qualities of entrepreneurs that I have aspired to from afar, and have really had to, like, I realized that my ulterior motive for doing all this work with entrepreneurs, and, I was really like, I'm just trying to figure out how to be happier, and like, it's like, I want to drink what they're drinking, I'll have what they're having. And action bias has been one of the really big kind of game changers for me, because I'm definitely kind of the disposition of person who will tend to get stuck in her head, right? And I'll tend to overanalyze in the absence of adequate data, right? Where somehow, and it's that kind of fear-driven, like, I want to get to clarity before I actually go and check, right? Because checking is scary,
right?
which is impossible, especially with anything that's new and, that's ambitious, because by the very nature of it, nobody will have done it. Nobody will have figured it out, including you. And there's no way to know except by going and, trying a bunch of stuff and having lack of clarity gradually kind of, chiseled into some sort of understanding. And so I think it's so important to kind of check that tendency in ourselves, and to realize, like, well, action bias really, it means data bias, right? It means
Learning bias.
actual learning bias, right? The caveat is, the action bias without the learning and the love of reality, the love of truth, just becomes another bias, right? In that you aren't being reflective about what action you're taking, and so you just can very easily get kind of taken down a garden path of, I'm just gonna, like, steamroll over all the signals that this isn't actually going to give me product market fit, and I'm just going to, like, no, we've come too far, we spent too much time on this, we're just going to keep trying, different little iterations, and just not look at the big picture that's emerged, and not pivot when we need to.
So for me, it's really, the word bias is not, it's just understanding that the learning happens when you do.
Out here.
Right, when you touch things,
Yeah.
and the feedback that you're getting from reality world, you're trying to do the things you do, is the best learning ever. And
Yeah.
so we call it analysis paralysis, but it's not really. And I see that, by the way, in our community, there's a lot of people who are just get stuck in there. They're thinking so much about what needs to be done, how, and so on. The thinking is just becoming an end in itself, where it's a, I always say, why do we have philosophy? It's a blueprint for what? For living, for doing, right?
Yeah.
It's just, it's not for unless you want to practice it all day long, which is pretty unique, I have to say. It's just, okay, I got it. And that was from the first minute. I remember opening Atlas and realizing what it's all about. There's something here that will teach me how to live out there. And there's a beautiful story from the Ayn Rand biographical interviews, where the government sends Rand's mother a questionnaire about the children. And one of the questions was like, is your child an introvert or an extrovert?
Ooh.
And she saw that her mother wrote that she was an introvert. And Rand went to her mother and it's like, why did you put me in as an introvert? She said, what do you mean? You're in your room reading books. And she became furious. It's like, why do you think I'm reading the books? Why do you think that I'm well, first I want to know how to live, but look at what's going on outside. And she's like, I don't know how old she is, maybe 11 or 12. And she tells the whole story about how upset she was that her mother characterized her as an
I
introvert.
mean, but she kind of was one, though.
Well,
just from a personality.
I don't know, but I think what I
But
got
also,
from
yes.
what I got from Rand, this is a philosophy for living, right? For going out and doing,
Yes,
and you can
that's the
make
key
mistakes and you can
Yeah.
come back and learn, but it's really the doing. And I think a lot of people that I work with, sometimes they don't overthink. They just go to the point where the thinking is irrelevant, adds no value.
Where
Like,
they've
there's
run out
no
of
way
data.
for us to project what's going to happen. There are too many assumptions in our plan. And you go out and you figure out most of the time that the questions you've asked are not the right questions at all. It's a completely different thing that is going to, we're going to hit another wall that we didn't expect, we didn't see. And this is why this combination of good planning, a lot of thinking on one end, and then going out and doing it and learning and coming back in this feedback loop of thought and action. And thought and action is where I think the magic happens.
Yeah, it's actually wanting to know. Like, I would think about action biases. Do you actually want to know? Or do you just want to sort of like feel as if
think about knowing.
You're knowing somehow in the absence of any actual knowledge, because knowledge is knowledge about the world.
Yeah. Let's talk about independence.
Sure. Let's talk about it.
You raised the point, so I'll let you start
Today?
with it.
Okay.
And autonomy, that's another big word.
That was especially,
Yes,
So I guess maybe that's an interesting angle from which to come at it, because I know the way that you often talk about kind of wanting to be an entrepreneur and how it kind of seemed like a no-brainer to you. It's like, why would I want to work for somebody else? And why would I want one of these 9-to-5 jobs where someone else is telling me what to do? And that feels very tied to wanting to be independent, wanting to use, your own judgment. And to me, those come apart in really important ways that I think kind of speak to that question of, well, in what sense are we all entrepreneurial, or ought to be? In what sense is this actually a very specific kind of job that that the first-handed thing to do might be to choose against being entrepreneur, or to choose the 9-to-5 job because you assess it as actually serving your particular profile of kind of needs and values, or being the right kind of learning and the right kind of structure for you to be able to kind of flourish and grow at that time in your life, right? So I think there's a real important distinction between like kind of the fundamental virtue of independence, the way that Rand meant it, where you're thinking firsthand, where you're forming your own judgments of what's true and what is actually good for you and what do you need and what will be the consequences over time, versus the kind of autonomy we were talking about, where you want to be your own boss. You want to set your own terms about, you don't want anybody telling you how to structure your day. You don't want to be reporting to anyone. You want to be the one kind of in the driver's seat of how you're going to structure things and what outcomes, what, KPIs, OKRs, what have you, you're going to be pursuing, and that's not actually the best thing for everyone. If I don't have some structure in my life, I just don't get anything done, and I end up wheel spinning and getting stuck in analysis paralysis despite knowing better and having all of this, insight. It's just really hard to apply in the absence of some sort of like scaffold to kind of give me something to hold on to and to get me back out of my head, and doing things. And granted, now I've learned how to set some of that structure up myself, but I couldn't have learned that if I didn't have somebody helping me with it for a while. So I think that's a really important difference.
I agree. And I think having worked with a lot of people, there's a lot of self-help that will tell you everybody needs to be an entrepreneur. Gary Vaynerchuk, I love his energy, and he's very motivational, and Tony Robbins, and all. It's like everybody needs to be an entrepreneur, and you need to open your own company and be. No, some people collapse.
That's second-handed, actually, right? You can be a second-handed entrepreneur. You can decide you're supposed to be one because that's
many of those.
The status.
They don't have the psychology for it. They don't have this
I've
resilience.
seen many. Yeah.
And they just
And they
collapse.
fail. And it's really miserable.
And they're miserable.
And the farther they get, the more miserable it ends up being.
And I think I've seen so many. For me, again, I'm one of those people. Like, I want to lead. If I'm not in the driver's seat, something's wrong for me. But I've seen people completely happy and fulfilled because where they're good at is execution. They get really confused in strategy, where everything's vague. We don't know what we're doing. If you get them into a strategy discussion, they're lost. I mean, what is the question? And the answer is there is no question. We're making it up.
Right.
And they're like, so I don't know what I'm doing here, right? So, and
Yeah.
when you come out of that meeting and then you go into the execution meeting, we're like, okay, that's what we decided. We're going to do A, B, and C. This is where they turn on. And those people cannot be CEOs. Because CEOs are always in this fog of like, what's going to happen next? I don't know what's going to hit us, or where are we going in this fog, right? And if you don't have that strategic mindset, don't be an entrepreneur. And I've seen a lot of people following advice of like, yeah, you should be in the driver's seat. And they become miserable.
I mean, but also just to valorize it a little bit more. It's not just, well, if you're not cut out for this strategic thinking, but also like lots of people would be wasted on entrepreneurship because they have more value to offer. Like Onkar shouldn't be an entrepreneur. No. Not necessarily, I'm sure he could figure it out, but like then we would lose Onkar, like the teacher and the sage who devotes his time and energy to teaching.
And just thinking about how people, where they thrive. And not a lot of people spend the time to think about the questions of when was the time where I really thrived?
Yeah.
What ignited me?
Really
and just
important question.
thinking and trying to derive the truths about themselves and what was it in that specific activity where I loved it so much. And for me, only a lot of introspection around this is where I thrive. This is what I did. I tell a story about, you know, I told the story today. I was selling software, and just to come back and realize that the whole process was not about selling software. It was about me presenting, being on stage presenting.
Yeah.
And it took me hours to just drill into what was so good about this sale, to just pull that thread that suddenly connected to many different experiences.
Yeah.
And you embrace it. It's like, I don't know how I'm going to make money out of it, but I need to be on stage talking about ideas or telling stories. And then there's an entrepreneurial path to figure it out, to forge.
In a way, that's your first principle, right? There's the first principles, thinking of our own self-creation.
That's what my rocket is made out of.
What is the common denominator? Yeah, it's like, what is the fundamental core ingredient that's in common to all these different things that I've really enjoyed, and what is different about all these different times that I've actually really not felt alive and energized, and I've felt bogged down, and I've just constantly been fighting myself. Like, what, you know, in a way, I'm still iterating on some of the details, as you know, because I'm vacillating. I can stay in academia. This is being aired publicly. Of course, there's no vacillation. Everything's all set for the rest of all time,
it's
in case my dean is listening. Yeah, but anyway, like there's things that I've been learning about myself. There are things that have been very clear. I love to write. You know, I love the kind of really intimate one-to-one connection that I am able to form with people that I'm coaching or treating, you know, who, like, we have this shared project of really kind of delving deep and getting to those really core insights about kind of who they are, what makes them tick, and, you know, and it's intense, and it's just so packed with meaning, and it's really focused, and like that I know, okay, whatever I do for the rest of my life, that'll be a huge component of it.
Right.
Easy. So, and that's in a way, like I can kind of rest on that foundation. As long as I'm doing that for some significant chunk of my time,
You're good.
It's not going to be so bad because, you know, I'm going to be a happy person.
I have the concept, so in the happiness team, we plot what I call a value galaxy, which is all the things I love about life. And then trying to derive from those things I love about life, what I call the value themes, which is basically the same concept of like, this is a deeper truth about me. Yeah. All of those things that I love have to do with my love of abstract ideas and deep truths. And all those values have to do with you know, my entrepreneurial spirit of forging a new path. I want to be the first doing something. And this has to do with communicating ideas. And this has to do with, I don't know, individualistic competitive sports. So I can actually make up new values or candidates for values.
Conceptualizations, right? Of
knowing
what is the thing that describes all of these different, okay. Yeah, exactly.
One last thing I want before we open it up for questions. We talked about challenges, and you said something that I'm interested in. What is the imposter syndrome?
It's so funny that you haven't heard that term. In a way, it's almost like you're innocent of it. Can I just see a show of it? Like, who's heard of imposter syndrome?
I don't know what it is.
You've somehow just been
I don't know. I missed
the
it somehow. Yeah.
The whole issue. No, that's
what are
great.
what are they imposing?
Yeah. So imposter syndrome, Tal, is the feeling that some people get when they're doing something really ambitious and hard, that like they don't know what they're doing, and that any minute now they're going to be exposed for not knowing what they're doing. You know, that they all think like I got hired into this role, or I got offered this, admission to this amazing like
And then
program.
people are going to find out I know.
And like, I actually have no idea what I'm doing. I have no idea. I don't know. I have no actual expertise. I'm not certain of anything. I don't know if this is the right way. Like they must think I know something I don't. And they, that any minute now they'll realize that this was a bad hire, or that, they were wrong about me because I'm actually just completely.
I just say it out loud.
Yeah, right. Well, that's the key. So, but that's it's the standard we're applying to ourselves. And I just, for the record, because it's the first time I've spoken to an entrepreneur who'd never heard of it or dealt with it, and that's to your credit, Tal. But like, it's near universal in my experience among early stage entrepreneurs, among graduate students, among, anybody who's starting out doing anything difficult. And sometimes they're good ways into it as well. So, and it doesn't correlate with actual performance like at all. And in some ways almost, if there's any kind of correlation, it's in the reverse direction of people who report having more imposter syndrome are actually overall performing better. Because you could imagine they tend to be the ones who are hard on themselves and holding themselves to high standards, or more self-critical, which is to say that I recommend that approach. It's just these things are vaguely correlated. But the thing about, if we think, well, okay, like, what am I assuming to be the kind of standard of success? What am I assuming is the way that knowledge and the way that competence looks like, right? What does it look like in a context where I'm doing something really hard that's at the edge of human understanding, right? Yeah. This is what it looks like. It looks like not knowing anything and having to do a lot of trial and error and a lot of, move fast and break things. And it's about kind of relying on your fundamental kind of judgment and conviction and commitment to learning, commitment to self-correcting. Like, that's what's going to differentiate you. It's not that you came in knowing more, because nobody even expects that, right?
No, I fully understand how that can happen. I just always found the best strategy is to say I don't know what I'm doing.
Right.
And admitting that.
It takes a lot of
I remember several
it.
meetings with venture capitalists that are really super smart. And I figured out that when you are super honest, like, he said, so what is your strategy here? What are you going to do? How are you going to make the monthly recurring revenue we set for this quarter? It's like, I have no effing idea of how I'm going to do it. Yeah. We're just going to give great service. We're going to continue to build the best product we can. And hopefully somehow it'll happen. And they're like, good for you.
Yeah. And this is what founders don't realize, is that like VCs and investors, the people who are hearing your pitch, like they know that you're not supposed to know anything yet. They know you're not going to have good answers. So when you come with this really like canned script, like, oh yeah, I've got this all under control. Oh yeah, don't worry, I have an answer to each.
They know you're faking.
It's all BS. They know it's BS. You know it's BS, right? And so the real superpower of the best founders is self-honesty, I have found, and the kind of self-trust that comes with it.
That's great. Well, we can go on for hours if you let us just talk to each other.
That's true.
We've proven that several times. We're like, let's meet for lunch, and then 3 hours later. Okay, so let's open it up. I'm fascinated with this, and I'm fascinated with the work Gena is doing. So let's open it up, and we'll take questions about.
So we have a few super chats from Jonathan, Kmetya, Bonnie, Apollo Zeus, and Bradley, who says excellent points, thank you. We have no super chat questions, so yeah.
Just super chats. So
the people, the people on YouTube, you can ask
go big
questions.
or go home.
Certainly not
I
about
agree.
Will
Here's
Smith,
some money.
But and anybody here?
Okay, I'm just gonna leave that there. Wait, so the super chats were all just statements?
And they were just super chats, I guess.
So thank you for the conversation.
My question is, do you have any thought about being entrepreneurial in a corporate environment?
In a corporate
Corporate
environment. Absolutely. I mean, I whenever I see a 21-year-old, 22-year-old, like, yeah, I'm going to open my startup. It's like, what do you know? You don't even know what you want to do or what's exciting to you. You're just in the process of figuring out, and discovering things. So go get passionate about something. And the way to learn is go to the biggest corporation you can find, because those biggest corporations are the most successful ones. They figure out something the small corporations didn't figure it out. But don't find yourself in a corner cubicle speaking to yourself all day. Go to those environments where there's a lot of learning happening.
Yeah.
You're meeting a lot of people. You can ask the right questions. Go be, carry somebody's bag for a month.
Yeah.
If they're a CEO or something, learn fast. And I found that within good corporations, when you're entrepreneurial, they'll let you have the space. Not only they let you have the space, they have a lot of resources. And they know that they're heavy and slow. So the smart managers, whenever they see someone in the mid-level management saying, I want to try something new, go for it, because the other alternative is to buy companies, and they're very expensive. So entrepreneurship that happens inside is happening all the time. We don't notice that because it's not that shiny, and this big company was sold for that. What do you think HP is making billions and billions out of? We haven't heard anything about something new in HP. They're making new stuff all the time. You just haven't heard about them.
Yeah.
But yes, so I would say there's a lot of room for that. You don't have to go risk everything you own. And if it gives you a lot of anxiety, try it in safer environments. Like we said, it's not for everyone. And some people want to go to the edge just for the sake of being at the edge. And that's bad. I think, I've seen several people that I've mentored in those incubators. They're there to say, I own my own startup. Because, they want to.
Right.
But they don't have the.
It's not because they actually want to do it.
Psychological infrastructure to hold that kind of pressure. Because the pressure is not just working hard. It's the variety of things you have to deal with. You think if you're an entrepreneur and I want to create some software, good luck. You won't be doing software very quickly.
You'll be selling and fundraising.
You'll be selling and fundraising most of the time, and you'll try to hire well, which is, I think, a big differentiator. Who knows how to hire well? You won't be coding, and you'll miss coding. So, so
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean,
there's a lot to be said about that.
That you've got a lot more of the relevant expertise on this. I guess if there's anything I would add, it would be it probably really depends on the culture of the particular corporation or corporate environment. Because what you're saying really seems to resonate with what I've read of some of the more kind of entrepreneurial corporations and the ways that they get to play and experiment and venture because they've got the comfort of, I keep coming back to Peter Thiel because I've been reading 0 to 1, which is just such a good book. But he talks about the creative monopolies, and that actually those are the corporations from which we all win the most, because they've outcompeted.
Everyone else.
They've actually come up with something so new and so far and away. But Google is not. There are no competitors to Google with respect to the search engine space.
Competition is for losers.
That's right. Yeah, literally. Right. Whereas Google, it's cornered the market on search engines, not by muscling in, or not by being predatorial, but just by coming up with something so good and so valuable and so amazing at what it does that no one else literally can compete. And so now they've got the luxury to be able to do research and development and to play with kind of other arms of the, to really think about how they want to set up the culture, right? And to think about the well-being of their employees and to try to not be evil as is their motto.
And in big corporations, another thing I would say is just find the right environment, because there are many environments in those big corporations. And if something doesn't work, one department is too bureaucratic and slow, move to another one, and you'll find other opportunities.
Yeah, and it's a question of sort of what is it enforcing for you? What is it kind of, what is it bringing to life for you? Because I've definitely heard of corporate cultures when combined with certain personalities or when combined with certain sort of sensitivities that, this is going to be soul crushing for you. Like, don't go work at Goldman Sachs if you're someone who already has this kind of status chasing tendency, for example. I'm not saying this is like my universal, prognosis, but it's an observation that I've made, right? That people who, they spend a certain amount of time kind of ladder climbing, like within a Goldman Sachs or within kind of one of these, or McKinsey, like one of these kind of corporate environments that's just very status-y and kind of very hierarchical and not necessarily that entrepreneurial actually in its sort of
Versus
spirit.
other companies, I remember it was Facebook at one point that says take 20% of your time and work on whatever project you want, and so on and so forth. So there are many ways to do it, not necessarily owning your own company. Other questions?
You spoke about embracing uncertainty.
It starts and then it stops.
Where are we? Sorry, I'm just trying. Oh, there we go. Hi.
Have any tips for embracing uncertainty? And also you spoke about the loop between thought and action and asking the right questions, and I wondered what would the process of asking the right questions be, or how would you go through that?
Yeah, those are great questions. Do you want to start or should I? Okay, so taking the uncertainty question first. So I've helped people with a lot of the intolerance of uncertainty, we call it, in psychology, and a lot of the kind of reorienting around, and this actually also gets at which questions to ask, because there are things we know. It's not the case that we're operating in a total vacuum usually, and I think it's largely about kind of reconstruing the level at which we are probing our own knowledge. So for example, I don't know if this next date is gonna, I don't know if this is gonna be the one. Like this often comes up in a dating context where it's like every single time I go on another date and then I start to like the person and then it doesn't work out for this reason or for that reason, I just don't know if I can take it anymore. It's like, I just need to know, like, well, am I or aren't I gonna find love? And it's like, whoa, that's a different question, right? Whether this next person or this next, whether any given date will turn out to be the one that's gonna, result in the love of your life, that's a very different question than if you keep at this and if you learn in the process and if you, in the meantime, kind of, use process of elimination and just kind of respect the probabilities of, it's gonna be a numbers game and it's gonna be a crapshoot, but this is the work of getting to that end goal, right, of finding my one and being happily ever after. Like, I do know that eventually, that I have a really good shot at that, right? Or it's the same thing in the entrepreneurial context of like Jeff Bezos kind of looks back on when he first left his cushy finance job to start Amazon, and he gave the probability of success that he himself kind of publicly assessed at that point for Amazon, for the bookstore that he would try, open online, was like 30% that it would sort of survive. And he didn't hesitate, right? He kind of went for a walk. He talked to his kind of mentor at the time, and then he decided, he thought about, okay, well, when I'm 80, will I regret having done this or having not done this? Even if, sure, probably I'll fail. But the thing is, I'll fail at this, but the internet is changing everything. I'm pretty sure about that. I don't know if it'll be a bookstore in the end. I don't know if it'll be, something completely, if it's going to be like the new way that everybody shops, right? And that kind of saves us all through a horrible pandemic. He didn't know any of that, but he knew like the internet is changing the way people interact and and kind of interact with each other and with merchandise. I need to try something in this domain, right? Tons of uncertainty, but also a deep conviction that's broader, right? It doesn't specify like, well, how long will it take or how many, kind of trial and error iterations or what will it look like exactly when you get to the end. But something about the internet is changing the face of commerce, and I want to be part of that. And well, I don't know, it could do any number of things as my kind of first pass at it, and books are, people both, like there were like various practical considerations around like bookstores can only hold so many books in them, and they're, so he kind of took a stab at it, right? But he had certainty about something. I think that's part of what I find really useful in this kind of first principles idea is go for the thing that's something you can hold on to, and then you can tolerate a lot of uncertainty sort of on top of it, right? When you've got that deep conviction, you can sort of dip down into it. And that also has to do with what question are you asking? Are you asking an answerable question or are you asking an unanswerable, right? And maybe you need to kind of zoom in or out on kind of the specificity of the question to get to one that might be answerable.
I think it's a key for making very, very tough decisions. Now in the happiness team that I'm doing, a lot of people are consulting with it, like, should I do this or should I do that? And for me, it always boils down to that deep conviction of like, it's the right thing to do. You know, because you can make up 1,000 excuses for and against, and you don't know how to make a decision. But in the end of the day, there's like this deep conviction that I don't know, I need a new relationship, or I need to quit my job and go do something else. And it doesn't matter at the end of the day how much analysis you're going to do in your head. That deep conviction is what you want to get to say, it's just a matter of time. I'm going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're talking about. What was the question about the thought and action?
Well, you spoke about the feedback loop.
That's right.
Yes.
The thought and action, and this being the philosophy for living rather than thinking about.
That's right.
You said something about we need to ask the right questions.
Right.
That's right.
So, yeah, the fastest way to learn is to have an hypothesis in your head that is based on some experience, and then go try it out and then see what comes back. It's just, you know, the scientific method, basically, in business, in action. And what I said about questions is what you find, the waste of time of sitting in your sofa and hypothesizing about what you need to be doing is the waste of time, because most of the time you're asking the wrong questions.
Yeah, I think,
So, yeah.
sorry to break it, I don't want to lose this thought that I think, so one key insight of this kind of empiricist movement within science, you know, which is annoying in a lot of other ways, but one thing I think gets really right is this idea of falsifiability, the idea, kind of the value of having a hypothesis that you could prove wrong if it's wrong, you know, and that you can hold yourself accountable to. So rather than like, yeah, I will someday eventually find love, I am going to have a better conversation by the 5th date than I had on my first date, because I'm going to be like taking the lessons of, okay, well, I wasn't really listening, and I'm gonna, you know, maybe it's about listening. So I'm gonna try this listening thing. I'm gonna see if that actually changes things for me. Like, I'm gonna see, does it actually go better, or does it actually feel just as awkward, but in a different way, in which case, okay, wrong hypothesis. Let me, you know, kind of regroup, and maybe I'll notice something else that then I can kind of test out, right? But kind of translate your theories into predictions that you can actually test in a time limit where it's not like, well, someday I'll know if I was right, but it's like, I can at least get some insight into this. I can get some relevant data to either update my prediction, you know, my level of certainty up or down within a foreseeable future.
And I want to say something about, so we talked about analysis paralysis, which is one thing, and a lot of people around you are never thinking. They're going through their whole life, experiencing, and never capture the data and go back home and analyze it. It amazes me. I'm having discussions with, like, okay, so what have you done about it? It's like, it's always been like that. And it's just, it's like they're falling from one thing to another without any thinking. So for me, again, deep thinking and analysis, but from data that comes from reality, not from your own mind, is trying to not
just
be,
from your own mind.
yeah,
Yeah.
concrete bound or lost in your head. The two ways to get it wrong.
Yeah, and I think keeping ourselves accountable with the questions we ask, with the hypotheses we form, is really, really key. I couldn't overstate that point.
Yeah.
Other questions?
So we had another super chat from Maria and one from Bradley, who asks, do you think offsetting your weaknesses with a co-founder is being dependent?
No.
No.
That was easy.
That's super rational. I mean,
I think you should definitely do that. I think that's a really good strategy.
compliment, not just, you know, if you're a manager, hire people that compliment, you know, what you're not good at. No, it's completely rational, and this is why we have companies. The whole idea of cooperation is because people are good at different things, and
Yeah, I mean, it's
beautiful when it works.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I think the reductio ad absurdum, and I think that's I can definitely understand what is motivating the question. I think it's good to be asking it. Mm-hmm. And I think to kind of see the fallacy in it, I would consider how different is that question from, is going to the grocery store instead of farming our own food a case of dependence,
Yeah.
right? Like when we rely on the division of labor within our society, when we hire people to do things for us, when we outsource, certain kinds of tasks or certain kinds of specializations, right, to other people, like, is that dependence? Well, it depends how we're going about it. It might be if we're actually not using our own judgment to kind of just, is this a grocery store that I like? Or, are these what's my nutritional perspective or whatever?
The best, I think, example is like, who made the iPhone? Everybody says Steve Jobs. No, he didn't make the iPhone. They're engineers that made the iPhone.
Yeah.
And the people with the ideas and the designers and the people in the labs and the technologies that enabled the iPhone. That he had a vision and he just hired the right people and managed them. But the people who really made the iPhone what it is are people that complemented each other and the team to bring something to life. And that's very, by the way, when we talk about teamwork and I hear a lot about in objectivism, yes, of course, cooperate as much as possible with people that have what you don't have and, in a win-win relationship. And when those sparks fly, I remember in a specific period of our startup, we were stuck with something and we brought someone from the outside who knew how to deal with those kind of infrastructural problems that we had no idea existed until our system started collapsing, right? And immediately, just seeing how we understood our problem and we explained what, the true nature, and it just clicked. And within days, boom, problem solved. It would have taken us months and months if we didn't cooperate and brought that expertise to the table. Absolutely. And someone who's willing to go to the deepest databases and figure out the logs. And it's like, okay, that's how it looks like to solve that problem.
Yeah, and like you said, hiring is one of the kind of superpowers, right, of a great founder. That's finding the people to do the things that you're either not that good at doing or that you wouldn't be able to do on your own, right? And you can do that in a way that's really independent, right? Where you're smart about your hiring decisions, where you're thinking for yourself about what are the complementary skills that I need and how will these three players actually complement each other as well as me, right? Same thing with getting a coach, right? So I'm coaching founders who are part of an incubator kind of program whose sole kind of ultimate purpose is to help you find a co-founder. And I've kind of seen very kind of directly how much that, in not every case, because there's no blanket rule like this in entrepreneurship, but in the vast majority of cases, you're just so much better off having a co-founder.
Of course, yeah.
What else?
Okay, Tal, just as an aside, I totally agree with you about the intrapreneur, and it's totally undervalued. Just go to a big company and innovate there.
Yeah.
It's way more resources, way more fun if you get it right. But my question is for Gena. I've been really interested in what Peter Thiel's had to say lately too, and I think he made a point that entrepreneurs in general are actually pretty bad at introspecting what has made them successful. Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that? And can you identify why?
Yeah, I mean, I think he would actually be a better judge of that than I am so far, because I've mostly worked with really early stage entrepreneurs who have no idea. I mean, they're not successful yet, so they definitely don't know what might make them successful, and that's a big part of what I'm working with them to do. And I've worked with some somewhat later stage, but yeah, I mean, it's really hard to know, like the kind of the causal reasoning and the kind of distilling of, I mean, like we're largely hypothesizing here about what, we've named maybe 10 different qualities that, this is the real differentiator. This, it's the first principles thinking. It's the independence. It's the knowing how to hire. It's like some mix of all of those things seems to matter, but it's probably not the same one in every case. And, it's really complicated, right? The kind of causal sequence that gets you. And there's actually a lot of luck involved. So it's actually hard to know how, what is the counterfactual where I didn't happen to meet that person at that party, or, I didn't end up riding that bike.
Market situation.
Or the market situation, right. So I think it's actually worth kind of holding those kinds of hypotheses lightly, and it's not necessarily a failing of the entrepreneurs. There are learnable skills that can make them better at it.
Another hypothesis I have is the fact that people can build products really well doesn't mean that they're great thinkers. And Peter Thiel is a great thinker.
Yeah.
And so when you find someone who's an entrepreneur but is a great thinker, this is where it runs really deep. This is why Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Steve Jobs, they're not, it's interesting to see that their videos about philosophy, if you will, or how they are so inspiring, even more than their products. I mean, when I want to get inspired, I open like a Steve Jobs, YouTube or something, and they're deep thinkers. And the way, so it doesn't mean that if you created a really successful software company and you sold it for billions, doesn't mean that you know exactly why it happened and how it happened. You just have qualities, and it worked. And they move on to the next thing. And it takes someone really deep and more philosophical. People don't know, but
we can know
Peter
in
Thiel is
broad
highly philosophical. I mean, I personally met him, and we've talked for hours about philosophy. And
I'm so jealous. Can you introduce?
I came for lunch, and I stayed for like 4.5 hours. It was great. And I mean, the level of thinking is just out of this world. And what's amazing is about everything.
Right.
It's not just about tech. If you read 0 to 1, it's deeply
It's an
philosophical.
analysis of history.
And the way
and
he
human
reduces
progress.
everything and just finds the one in the many. I love his 2x2 matrices that make everything so simple. Just deep thinkers. And Elon Musk is a deep thinker. The way he thinks about things is, first principles, for instance. I would wish he would think about philosophy in first principles like he does in physics, but that's another thing. It's just, and introspection is a rare quality. I mean.
And a necessary one. And I think founders, like within Silicon Valley, I think founders are sort of starting to realize that. Like there's much more of a kind of interest. In some ways, they're also going wrong with it because now it's all Zen master style, right? It's like Buddhist, the transcendental meditation and what have you, and work-life separate, yada, yada, yada. But they're starting to recognize like, wow, okay, I really need to actually learn how to take care of myself and how to think about my own motivations and how to check my own, how to communicate, how to have hard conversations and give constructive feedback, because that's just not something I'm going to be able to just naturally do because I screw up the courage. Like I actually have to learn skills and I have to self-reflect and maybe journal. I think there's a rising awareness that you build yourself alongside your company.
And the reason why Stoicism is so big in Silicon Valley, it's just they need
That's
a
the Zen
philosophy,
master.
right?
It's really
Exactly.
Stoicism. That's what it comes down
Right.
to.
So go read The False Promise of Stoicism by Aaron Smith. It's a good one.
It is a false promise.
Razi, anything else? Or? Yeah.
Do you think that altruism plays a role in imposter syndrome?
Probably sometimes. I hadn't specifically thought about that combination. It's the kind of thing where, it's going to play some role in everything because it's a moral code, and to the extent that we've internalized it, it's going to affect how we our whole kind of causal perspective on our own actions and our own values. But I don't think that it's necessarily the explanatory factor for imposter syndrome any more than for any other, for anxiety or in general, or for intolerance of uncertainty. I would say, yes, because it's a wrong standard that is kind of acausal and that is somewhat arbitrary. And so when we compare ourselves against that standard, inevitably we don't measure up. And so to that extent.
I was thinking partly too, like I don't deserve to take credit.
I think that's something a little different, but definitely that correlates highly with imposter syndrome, and that also happens a lot.
Now that I understand what it is, it sounds to me that it's like the fallacy of infallibility and omniscience. That has to do because we always think of like, Einstein, he just sat there and everything, and Edison, and like we don't see the messiness and the trial and error of every great invention. I just came back from Italy, and we had a really good tour guide in the Vatican, and she told us the stories about Michelangelo, and just the stories are amazing. He said, he's a very talented. Here's David, here's the Sistine Chapel. It's like, no, this is not how it worked. And what you project as an entrepreneur is like, He started a company when he was 23 and, you know, and he was a
Looked
billionaire by
back,
20.
and-
And I'm
Right.
not, right? And so he's perfect. He knew exactly what he was doing,
Right.
and I don't, because they haven't been there. So this idea of like, oh, full certainty, and you want to know exactly what we're doing. Steve, I don't know if people remember the Newton device. I owned one from Apple. It was the worst thing ever. It was horrible.
The Newton device?
Yeah.
I don't remember this.
Right? That was what it was called. Not
This is
Newton.
good
yeah.
fodder for.
It was horrible, and Steve Jobs made it, and it failed, and then they made a phone, and it failed, and
And then he got fired from his own company, though that
Yes,
wasn't
yes.
entirely his fault. But
So-
also, he could have handled it better.
Right,
you know.
right.
So,
So-
lots of learning that happens.
if you want to create something big, be ready to fail a lot. Be ready to fail.
And to not know what you're doing, right? And to operate in a state of high uncertainty.
And what's amazing when you're talking to those successful people, when they reflect back, they remember the low points as something memorable. Say, yeah, I got the billion, you know, who cares?
But that day
But
that I was
that
about
day
to
when
quit,
it was so
and-
hard
yeah.
in the lab, and we could, so
So listen to those stories. I mean, one thing is I think collect, and I'm trying to sort of like collect those stories. And
Yes.
at some point there should be a repository. You know, there's this book, Late Bloomers, that kind of tells some of the relevant, you know, like people who are amazing now, but they were losers at 30. And you think, oh, well, everybody who's anybody must have been, you know, must have made it by 30. But I think we need to act, it's sort of like why we need history, right? So that we kind of learn from the mistakes and the kind of lessons of those who came before us. But this is sort of like the personal histories of people who have been extremely successful. It's like,
Yeah.
this is what the work looks like.
And one last thought that really comes in full circle, really the self-creation attitude is that at any given point in time in your life, it doesn't matter what you've done and what stories you tell yourself about yourself, and I'm this and I'm not that, and you're wrong most probably. Because you can do a lot of things that you don't know you're capable of. It's just a matter of deciding and understanding what it'll take to follow a dream or follow a passion.
Yeah.
And what I'm trying to do in my happiness team is to spark something in people's minds to believe that they can, because they want it, they've clarified that they have a desire, they have a value they want to pursue. And the pursuit is fun. It's not easy, but it's, if you have the right attitude, it's, and I ask always, what is the alternative? What is really the alternative? Because if you're not pursuing deep values and ready for the struggle, there's no story in your life. I'm watching Game of Thrones with my son. And he's a character designer, so he enjoys the character building. And I enjoy the stories, like they're making it so horrible. But what I'm taking from it is like, if you want to tell an interesting story, some parts need to be horrible. Otherwise, it's not memorable. And you're writing the story of your own life.
I mean, don't like go out of your way
Don't go
to make the horror. Like,
yes.
don't worry, it will happen. It'll take care of itself.
Exactly.
Go for the stuff worth doing, and there'll be
Something
plenty
you're
of
passionate
hardship
about,
along
and
the way.
Try to avoid
Yeah.
suffering as much as possible. But if it comes, it comes. It's
Well, the
part
point
of
is
the
like
journey.
it's not about the suffering.
Yeah, it's not
right?
about that, but
It's
it's
about
just
the thing worth doing.
exactly something
going
worth doing and persevering. I've talked to one of the most successful VCs, and he says the one thing that I'm looking for is fortitude, or two things: fortitude and resilience. That's it. I
big
want
buzzword.
to see a
Yeah.
story when the entrepreneur tells me I've fallen to the ground, I've hit really hard, but I stood up and I tried again, and then it happened again, and I stood up, because I know they're going to fail, and they're going to pivot 3 times before they make a really big company. Those are the people I'm looking for that won't break and just fall into pieces. And the only way to become that is to do it, just to do it and do it and do it.
Yeah, it's true.
We have time for one more
One
question.
more, okay.
Before we go to the last question, so Mary-Aline asked about altruism, and Gena, you mentioned Encore, so I do want to tell people that this Thursday,
Nice.
Encore,
Well, like, you're
Encore will
good
be
at
here.
selling, Russ. You should be an entrepreneur.
I am. I'm going to
He
sell the
is,
T-shirts again.
Actually, that's a good point. You are being an entrepreneur as we speak.
So Onkar will be joined by, that's Onkar Gate, he will be joined by Aaron Smith here on Thursday to talk about the moral case against altruism. And that will
That's
also,
Just kidding.
yeah, that's also going to follow an episode of The Daily Objective. So I hope you all join us for that. And for our last question.
Make it a good one, just kidding.
It's the last question.
No
so-
pressure.
So I hope you can forgive the abstractness of this question, but this is something that I've been thinking about recently. And it goes to the topic of advice and kinds of advice. So for me, there's like two forms of advice. There's the advice that takes the form of do more of this or do less of that. So for example, have a bias for action, I think is of that form. And then let's call that directional advice.
Or directive, yeah.
And the other kind of advice is if you want to achieve this thing, you need to do this thing. Or you need-
Conditional, if you will,
So
yeah.
for your height, you should have this weight, this percentage
Oh,
of body
interesting.
fat. So the direction is just derived from your position relative to that thing that you need. And let's call that like destinational advice or absolute advice. So I read a lot of self-help and philosophy, and I find that too much of the advice is of the former form, and I find that less useful. It can be useful, but it depends on your, disposition. So what do you guys think of the value of either kind of advice, and do you think that I'm right to be annoyed that there's too much advice that is of the
Yes.
former form?
Absolutely. Sorry.
Yeah,
Do you wanna finish?
I'll start because I'm reading a lot. I'm interested in it because I'm doing it with the happiness teams. The problem is they don't have a philosophy. That's it, basically. You read a book.
But the people in the happiness team all have a philosophy, technically.
No, I'm talking about the gurus of self-help.
I see, okay.
Sorry. I should have made it clear.
Just want to clarify.
No. I'm talking
Look,
I'm talking about
that was the-
self.
that's the one
I'm
thing
talking
we
about the
have in common.
self-help, the writers, the gurus,
I see.
and all the people that write books over books about do this, do that, do this. If you do this, you get more money. If you do this, you get the girl, you get the fame. And going back to first principles, I'm reading their books, and I was like, what is this all based off of? How do I know that what he's saying or she's saying is true? And I'm now, I can actually flip the book and read the description and just know if this is a book worth reading or not, because they will tell you a lot of things that are true. I mean, they come out with the right recommendation about, and some good principles about how to think about things and so on and so forth. But it's not grounded on anything. So you get 3 good advice and 1 horrible advice. And one is completely egoistic and the other one is altruistic, and do this and succeed and then give it away. And being part of the Silicon Valley, that killed me. I mean, the smartest people giving you the best advice how to do the smartest thing, and then I remember it just killed me where someone I really admired gave a TED talk and started crying because of climate change. I was like, this guy's one of the smartest people ever. I mean, he created trillions in wealth, okay? And has no philosophy to ground himself. So he never can enjoy the amount of wealth that he's created because of lack of that. And I think what's going on in all the self-help world is, I call it, do it because it worked for me kind of advice. So it's not just the type of advice that I think you're right to identify. It's like, where is it coming from? And based on what philosophy, what moral code that guides you to what end? So they're coming up with great formulations, and some of them, it's great advice. The recent one is like the subtle art of not giving a, you know what? The guy is brilliant. I mean, the presentation is fabulous. I wish I could write like this. And one chapter is like awesome. One chapter is, what is this about? It's like, I don't know. And it's just random blurbs on do this, do that, do this, do that, because it sounds good and there's a story to tell. Malcolm Gladwell you'll agree with me, a phenomenal writer. Is what he's saying true? Some of the time, but the formulations are amazing. So it's like one of my, one manager, they said, it doesn't matter what you talk about as long as you're talking about it with passion. That was his formulation. And in a way, it describes the self-help world. Jordan Peterson. Can you think about the presentation? The guy is a storyteller. He was born to tell stories. But half of what he says is completely nuts. I mean, malevolent universe premise presented. So 12 rules for life, I don't know, maybe 3, 4 are good, and the other,
So
I'm very suspicious of that world, yeah.
Yeah, so I agree with a lot of what you're saying, obviously. And I kind of want to zero in on where do I have a somewhat more nuanced or just, slightly different kind of emphasis. And I think we've talked about this before, but I think for the benefit of our crowd, I think
We didn't argue, by the way, at all.
well, I guess this is our chance, Tal. All right, let's see how heated we can get in this last minute. But so granting that absolutely philosophy, we know philosophy matters, and we know that that's a kind of necessary, if not sufficient, condition for being able to kind of ground any given advice in a context that then actually makes it objective and makes it applicable to any given person's life and allows them to evaluate it for themselves. It's very salient to me as someone who, I've spent what feels like ungodly amount, 15 years now working at trying to figure out the right ways to advise people, in effect. And I've had objectivism all along, right, from the get-go. And I've learned a lot. And I've also learned, some of the things that I thought I knew, but I didn't actually know, or that I assumed that actually turned out to be misguided, or that work really well for some people and then are just completely the absolute dead wrong approach for other people who actually, if I give them this form of advice, or if I try to provide them with the kind of structure of a worksheet, that's actually just going to make them feel really kind of bogged down, and suddenly they're going to be kind of doing it for me, and they're going to be just in a really unhelpful kind of mental mode. And it's not obvious when that's going to be true for whom. And a lot of the ways that I think self-help books aren't objective is not necessarily just because they don't have the right philosophy, but because they don't respect the epistemic work involved. And I think I don't think we're exempt at all, from those challenges. I think
agree.
it's really it's a science figuring out, what are the if-thens, and when and for whom is what going to be helpful, and when should we spell them out, and when is it going to be, because there's always an implicit if-then, I think, right? Whether that's, well, if you want to be an entrepreneur, which of course you do, because why would anybody not want that? Go and have an action bias and, go and find a co-founder, or, if you're like me and you struggle with these things, So there's at least an implicit if that just isn't being spelled out a lot of the time. Even if it is, then we have the benefit of being able to assess it and to actually, see if it applies to us. Like, is this my if? Is this something I want? Is this something I struggle with? Am I this height, or do I want this kind of physique or whatever? But also, like, do I buy the causal claim, right? That if I do these things, and if I want this outcome, like, these are going to be the tools that get me, given my whole context, from point A to point B. And those are scientific questions as much as they are philosophical ones, and it's often not obvious, right? It's sort of like, when should I be writing things down? And when can I kind of trust my own introspection? Or when should I be asking myself really abstract questions? And when should I just be actually thinking about the kind of the implementation and the how? When's that going to actually get me kind of stuck? And when's that going to give me the push that I need, rather than getting really paralyzed by the kind of overwhelmingness of the big why questions? And what are the particular contexts that, for me, kind of trigger those different modes where, okay, I'm going to be in drill sergeant mode here, so I really don't need to be reminding myself, of my failures at that particular moment. That's actually really the last thing. Like, what I need is actually just some encouragement and support, right? Or like, right now, I actually just need someone to listen to me. I don't need advice at all, right? Like, those are things that we learn with time, and that there's a lot of data that we can collect. And I think the default is people jump to conclusions and overgeneralize from their experience.
Overgeneralizing, I would say
And that's true for all of us. I don't think philosophy exempts us from it. So that's kind of just the one caveat I wanted to throw in there.
Right. Thank you for listening. It's been interesting, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Tal. This is always